Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be the first to catch our next eerie tale. Now, let's get into it. When I was 11, my best friend Emily and I went trick-or-treating for the last time. We both dressed as witches, but Emily added a black velvet ribbon around her neck. It didn't quite match her costume. And when I asked her why, she just said, "It's for luck." Emily always had her quirks. She believed in superstitions, like knocking on wood and carrying a lucky coin. The ribbon seemed like just another of her oddities. But by the end of the night, I realized it was something much darker. We wandered through our neighborhood, collecting candy and chatting as usual. Everything felt normal, but I had an odd, lingering sensation that we weren't alone. I kept glancing behind us, feeling eyes on the back of my neck, but there was never anyone there. At some point, Emily suggested we take a shortcut through a small wooded park near the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't an actual park, more like an overgrown plot with a path leading to a different street. It was dark and always gave me the creeps, but we were tired and the shortcut would get us home faster. As we entered the park, the wind picked up, carrying what sounded like faint whispers. I tried to dismiss it, but the air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken warning. Emily stopped suddenly, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, a shadow moved between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to be real, but I saw it, darting from one side of the path to the other. My heart raced, and I grabbed Emily's arm. "Did you see that?" I whispered. She only nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We started walking faster, but no matter how quickly we moved, the shadow seemed to follow, growing closer with every step. It darted ahead of us, blocking the path. We stopped, staring at a dark figure that seemed to shift and flicker like smoke. It wasn't solid, but its form resembled a tall person with an unnervingly wide grin. We ran, the whispers growing louder, almost like laughter. By the time we burst out of the park and onto the next street, I looked back and saw nothing, just the rustling leaves and the echo of distant trick-or-treaters. When we reached Emily's house, she turned to me, her face still pale. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered. "Promise me." I promised, though I didn't know why. The next day, Emily didn't answer my calls. Her mother told me she was resting, but wouldn't say more. Days turned into weeks, and Emily stayed home, not coming to school or answering messages. When I visited, her mum wouldn't let me see her, just saying, "Emily needs time." When Emily finally returned to school, she looked thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes. But the most unsettling thing was the black ribbon. She was still wearing it, tied tightly around her neck. I asked her about it, but she refused to talk. "You shouldn't have come to the park," she said, her voice hollow. Over the years, we drifted apart, Emily becoming more withdrawn. Every time I saw her, she wore that same ribbon, and eventually, people stopped asking about it. The last time I saw Emily was right after graduation. I tried to reconnect, to talk about what happened that Halloween, but when I mentioned it, she turned cold and told me to leave. Years later, I got a call from her mother, telling me that Emily had passed away. At the funeral, I noticed something strange. The black ribbon was still around her neck, tied as tightly as ever. When I asked her mother why it hadn't been removed, she just shook her head and whispered, "She insisted." Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers calling my name, soft, distant, and familiar, and I wonder if whatever followed Emily that night has found a new shadow to linger in. When I was 12, my friends and I decided to sneak into the old abandoned pumpkin patch on the edge of town. It was the week of Halloween, and we had heard rumors about it for years. Whispers of missing children, strange sightings, and eerie noises that came from the field late at night. But we were kids, and to us, that only made it more exciting. The patch hadn't been used in decades. The farmer who once owned it, Mr. Hayward, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The town never talked about what happened, but every Halloween, Kids dared each other to sneak into the patch and pick one of the rotting pumpkins. It was a rite of passage, something that meant you weren't afraid of old legends or dark fields. We agreed to go on Halloween night. The air was heavy with the chill of autumn, and as we made our way to the edge of the field, the excitement turned into unease. The gate creaked when we pushed it open, and the silence that followed was unnerving, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The field was overgrown and tangled with dead vines. Rotten pumpkins, long forgotten, sat decaying in the patches of tall grass. Their carved faces collapsed into themselves like old, sad memories. I remember one of my friends, James, laughing nervously as he picked up a shriveled pumpkin, joking about bringing it home as a trophy. But his voice was shaking, and it only made the silence around us seem louder. As we ventured deeper into the field, something felt off. The ground felt soft, almost like it was giving way beneath our feet. The moonlight cast long, distorted shadows, and every time I looked back, it felt like something was moving just out of sight. Then we saw it. A lone, massive pumpkin sitting in the center of the field. It was the only one that wasn't decayed, almost as if it had been waiting for us. The strange thing was that there was a small hole carved into it, no bigger than a fist. It wasn't shaped like a traditional jack-o'-lantern. It was more like a tunnel leading into darkness. James, ever the daredevil, walked over to the pumpkin, shining his flashlight into the hole. "Check this out," he whispered. "Looks like someone's idea of a joke." But it wasn't a joke. As he peered closer, we all heard it, an almost imperceptible rustling sound, like something moving deep within the pumpkin. James froze, and we held our breath, watching as he slowly leaned in, trying to see what was inside. Then he screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of agony, like something had reached out and grabbed him. James staggered back, clutching his face, blood seeping through his fingers. His eyes were wide and he was babbling incoherently, saying that something was inside, that something had looked back at him. We ran, barely able to drag James with us. The vines seemed to come alive, twisting around our ankles, pulling us back toward the patch. By the time we reached the edge of the field, James was shaking violently, his face ashen, whispering about the eyes he saw inside the pumpkin. He kept saying, "They're watching. They're all watching." We got James home, and his parents took him to the hospital. They said he'd had a seizure, that maybe the field triggered some kind of reaction, but I knew better. We all did. None of us talked about it afterward, as if speaking the words would bring whatever was inside the pumpkin closer. A few days later, James disappeared. His parents said he must have run away, that he was dealing with the trauma of what happened, but I knew he was still in that field, somewhere beneath the rotting pumpkins and tangled vines. It's been years since that night, but I still see his face in my dreams, twisted with terror as he looked into the darkness. And every Halloween, I hear whispers, like voices calling me back to the patch, beckoning me to finish what we started. They say the pumpkins are rotting from the inside, that the land is cursed. But I know the truth. Those pumpkins aren't decaying, they're waiting. It was the morning after Halloween when I found a mask lying on my bedroom floor. An old, tattered mask of a face I didn't recognize. The problem was I lived alone and I hadn't worn a costume the night before. I've always been cautious, keeping my doors locked and windows shut. I'm not one to go out much, so I spent the night inside, ignoring the trick-or-treaters who knocked and hollered outside. But when I woke up, there it was. A grotesque mask lying just a few feet from my bed. It looked old, its rubber cracked and discoloured, with a chillingly realistic expression of twisted glee. It didn't belong to me, and I knew for a fact it wasn't there when I went to sleep. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. Maybe some kids from the neighbourhood had found a way in while I was asleep. But that uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I picked up the mask and examined it. It was heavier than it looked, and there was a damp, mouldy smell clinging to it, like it had been hidden away somewhere for years. The inside was lined with old stains, and something dark that looked like it might have been dried blood. As I turned it over in my hands, I felt a sudden wave of dizziness. It was like the room was spinning, and for a brief moment I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I dropped the mask and stumbled backward, breathing heavily. It landed face up on the floor, staring up at me with its empty eye sockets. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe I had just overreacted. Maybe it was just some elaborate joke. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. How did the mask get into my locked bedroom? And why did it feel so personal? I decided to do some cleaning, to distract myself. As I moved around the house, I kept finding other small, inexplicable things. A muddy footprint by the back door. A window that I was sure I had locked, now slightly ajar. And in the living room, a strange, lingering smell of something metallic, like old pennies. Every little thing was adding up, and yet it all seemed impossible. I checked the windows, the doors, every lock in the house. Everything was secure. No sign of forced entry, no clues left behind. But the feeling of being watched persisted, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing softly against the back of my neck. I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer, at least not alone. I grabbed my keys, shoved the mask into a drawer, and left, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I drove aimlessly for hours, just to clear my head, but the feeling wouldn't leave. The weight of those empty eyes seemed to follow me, no matter where I went. When I returned home, the mask was gone. The drawer where I had hidden it was wide open, and the mask wasn't there. Panic set in. I checked every room, every corner, but there was no sign of it. I started questioning my own memory. Maybe I had misplaced it. But how could I have? I hadn't even taken it out of the drawer. I tried to sleep that night, but every little noise jolted me awake. I kept imagining that mask, wondering if I'd find it again in the morning, lying somewhere else in the house, waiting for me. I must have finally drifted off at some point, because I woke up in the dark, a heavy silence hanging in the air, and then I heard it, the faint rustling of something moving in the hallway outside my bedroom door. I lay there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. The sound grew closer, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their feet. Then the door creaked open. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I felt the presence. I could hear breathing, slow and shallow, as if something was standing just inside the doorway, watching me. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, and as the beam cut through the darkness, I saw it. The mask was lying at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes staring up at me. But this time, it wasn't empty. There was a face behind it, a face twisted into that same grotesque grin, barely visible beneath a thin layer of rubber. The eyes were wide and unblinking, and as I stared, the grin seemed to widen. I screamed and bolted from the room, running out of the house without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbour's front porch, pounding on their door until someone let me in. I told them everything. But when the police arrived, they found nothing. No mask, no footprints, no signs of anyone else having been in the house. I've moved since then, but I still can't sleep without checking every lock, every window, every night. And every Halloween, without fail, I find something small in my home. A muddy footprint, a scratch on the wall, or a faint smell of mould and metal. A reminder that somewhere out there, someone or something is still watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. And every year, I wonder if one day I'll wake up and find that mask staring down at me again.